Hello, good evening. How are you? Doing well? Louder? You doing well? Yeah, okay, cool. I'm excited to be here, guys. I've been to Memphis, I think, 3 times in the last month. And I'd visited previously, but I seem to keep coming back. In fact, my friends are starting to move to Memphis from elsewhere, from the Northeast. So it's nice to come down to Memphis and see a lot of familiar faces, people I've been collaborating with, talking with, working with recently. When I walk around your city, I see a lot of opportunities. I see a lot of challenges, but I see a lot of opportunities. Does anyone know where this is? This neighborhood? The Edge, right? We're actually going to be looking in the boot camp at the Edge a little bit more closely tomorrow. But what I want to say about it is when I see something like this, a normal intersection of street signs, with someone else's homemade DIY sign, I don't even know what it really means. Does anybody know?
He's an artist.
He's an artist. I love it. Makes me feel at home. When I see the street art, I see the alleys, I see a lot of the creative things that are happening there, I get really excited. It makes me feel like I'm seeing where creativity and ideas are happening in your city. So who am I? I run a company called Street Plans. We do a lot of urban planning and design work, a lot of bike and pedestrian and public space work. But what I really love and what I love doing in terms of driving that work is research and advocacy. And we kind of scrunch those 2 words together. We believe really strongly in having a reason for why we're doing the consultant work that we do in the projects. We are based in Miami, Florida, which is where I started the company 5 years ago, and then I'm now located also, along with Aaron, in Brooklyn. So what inspired me about the power of the temporary and the short term was an event called Open Streets. Who's heard of Open Streets? Just a few hands. All right. Open Streets is one of my favorite days of any day out of the year. I like to travel around and see open streets in other cities because what it is temporarily taking a street that's normally filled with cars. You ban the cars for maybe 4 hours, 6 hours, maybe 8 hours, and you open it up to people, to bike, to walk, to socialize, to dance, to pretty much do anything. Basically create linear town squares out of an asset, out of a resource that is normally used for one single purpose. When we did this in Miami, it had a dramatic impact on the community there. I was involved with a lot of projects in the city, particularly doing a zoning code reform project, not the sexiest thing in the world, but something that I was pretty into. And when I went from meeting to meeting for projects like those, you'd get a room, maybe half the people that are in the room tonight. You'd see the maps and the diagrams on the wall, and we had these conversations, and I could just start to tell it was really hard for people to understand renderings and maps and what that meant really for them in the real world. That translation was difficult. When I saw this happen in our city, it was completely different. Thousands of people could understand, finally, when we say bikeable, what that means. When we say walkable, what that means. And so we've gone on to use this as an inspiration for all the work that we've been doing moving forward. When we started our company, we want to take things like open streets and empower other communities to do it because it is so transformational. And then at the same time that open streets are starting to really take off, and by the way, there's more than 100 across North America now. I want to see Memphis organize their own sometime in the next year or so. That would be a great thing. But while that was starting to happen and rise up, I was also watching what other cities were doing from afar, from Miami, and seeing what New York was doing, taking streets and reclaiming them for people just using temporary materials, literally just using paint. This is actually Broadway, right at Columbus Circle. And they were, as described in a blog post by this landscape architect, very tactical. Very small scale moves. And so when I read his post about what was happening there, I looked up the word tactical in the dictionary. And what I found was this definition of or relating to small scale actions serving a larger purpose. I was like, aha! Not only does that describe open streets and the plazas that are being put into the streets of New York, but what I was seeing in cities across the country. Reading blogs, looking at YouTube, and seeing what people were doing to enact change, oftentimes without government, with big grants or funding, is going out and doing it themselves. And I found that, again, to be very inspirational. So we wrote up a quick manual about these projects that were happening in 2010. Actually, it was 2011. And I put it online, I went on vacation, I came back from that vacation, and lo and behold, more than just 10 people had read the thing. I kind of sent it out to just my other nerdy planning friends, Jen Krause being one of them, and more than just those 10 people read it. And so I was really, really surprised by that. But I think what happened is we really struck this nerve that people are hungry to create change. They're hungry for access and opportunity to do it in their neighborhood and not wait years and years and years and years or go through conventional processes. So we've gone on to do a couple more volumes and translate into Spanish and all this, and it's been read around the world. And that's not because we're doing anything special. It's because we've got the internet and the way to share information now. It can be so quick to see what's happening in another city and say, you know what, I can do that in my city. I'm going to do it. And I love that this platform, this idea, has helped other people think about those projects and what they can do in their own community. So this is a picture of North Adams, Massachusetts. Every summer, they turn one of their streets into a beach in the downtown. Very creative repurposing of a street. Normally you wouldn't see nearly as many people hanging out on that block. You wouldn't see families playing in the sand, obviously in the middle of the street. And this is the kind of idea that captures people's imaginations and lets them understand the possibilities of a different future and the possibilities of change. But the word tactical and tactical urbanism as this movement is really part of a much larger cultural movement that we've been seeing and observing, not just in cities, not just in North America, but all over the world. Whether it's the DIY or this idea of hacking, computers or otherwise, temporary and guerrilla and pilot projects. Do these words ring true to some of you? You've been hearing these words more often in your reading? Yeah? See if you're shaking heads. But we decided to really think about this for a while and then finally put to words what tactical urbanism is all about. And what we found through our research is that it can be city-led, led by organizations and nonprofits, but in a really exciting way, it's also led by citizens. And the real crux of it is intent. You can be starting at the smallest scale with no funding, or $100 in funding, or $10,000 in funding. But the whole point is that you're thinking about the long term in the very beginning, and how you're going to get there through small iterations, and being able to adjust all along the way as you learn. I'll explain that a little further. In our projects, we see so many start in an unsanctioned manner. No one's sponsoring them, again, no one's funding them. And they start on this side of the spectrum, and they move to sanctioned very, very quickly. When neighborhoods and people get behind good ideas, it's incredibly how fast that goes from being this fringe activity or fringe idea to being supported by a city councilor, to winning its way through the system, becoming policy, creating physical change. It's really been just phenomenal to watch that process on so many different kinds of projects. This is not tactical urbanism. This might be cool. It can be DIY, it's street art for sure, but we don't call it tactical because there's not really a long-term intent with covering a bicycle in yarn. It's called yarn bombing, by the way. I've seen very attractive instances of yarn bombing. This is somewhere in the middle. But again, it's not tactical. So we try to differentiate. It's not just hipsters. It's just not me and my friends in Brooklyn and people living in the edge in Memphis or wherever. This is really about neighborhoods. People coming together, working both bottom up, top down, everything in between to affect change. This is a picture that I just love because it shows a whole community working together, from a little girl who's actually not doing so much work in this picture, but all the way to older folks in the neighborhood. I love that intergenerational aspect of it. And it's not just for our core, most urban places. I was in Orlando last week doing a couple workshops, and someone there has been a force behind the food trucks. I mean, just pushing them and creating this whole movement, and people are just gravitating towards starting businesses now on trucks, not just food, but retail businesses as well. And he organizes this incredible rally of food trucks in a suburban mall parking lot. This is, Orlando's already quite suburban. 20 miles out, it's really suburban. And that's where he's bringing together hundreds of people, entrepreneurs, activating space that is normally very, very vacant, giving a new purpose to a place that only used to do one thing, which is to park cars. I don't know about you, but I find that really inspirational. That's taking what you're given and making something better out of it. And it's not new. I always ask this question. Some of you have heard this 3 or 4 times already this week, but who knows where this is? Paris, right. This is Paris, France. If you've been, on the other side of these green boxes is the Seine, the main river that cuts through the city. This might be at 8 a.m. in the morning. If you're there by 9, 9:30, it looks like this. Those boxes pop up. And they're kind of the original pop-up shop, so to speak. And what they do is they just sell, magazines and newspapers and things like that, print media. But it gives you all these interesting visual things to look at as you walk down the street. When I was there in 2007, I got really interested in this project. Why are there hundreds of green boxes, wooden boxes along the Seine? It doesn't really jive with the aesthetic of the middle of Paris. You think of sort of pop culture and all the things that Paris stands for, and these dingy green boxes don't really comply with that. But this project, the green boxes go back to the 1500s. I won't read through the timeline here, but the whole point is that they were illegal, they were setting up shop, they were ticking off brick and mortar business owners, and over time, they just didn't go away. They kept showing up, they kept selling books along the river, and pretty soon the city started to regulate that, gave them some boxes and said, fine, do it out of those boxes. There's hundreds of them now along this end, and it's part of the UNESCO World Heritage Site, which designated the whole banks of the river to be such. So I like to say this is a unsanctioned to sanctioned timeline of 500 years. And it's happening much faster today, which is exciting. Food trucks, play streets. As soon as we introduce cars onto our city streets, we try to take them back, temporarily anyways, by having streets where kids could play close to cars. This is one of my favorite projects of all time. This is a pop-up park on an on-ramp, freeway in San Francisco in 1970. Reminds us that so many of the things that we're doing today that we think are creative have been done before, have been done really well. I think personally the difference is that we've got a lot more power behind projecting them. I think this project, which is called Portable Parks, had a bunch of media hits in San Francisco in 1970. I guarantee nobody in Memphis read about it, nobody in New York read about it, or elsewhere. But now, you go back and you can see these projects, and this project is now becoming increasingly famous as people are aware of it. But the artist is a commentary on the lack of green space and public space and the effect that highways are having on the neighborhoods. And I have no idea, but she was able to get permission from the state DOT to put a park on an on-ramp. I don't know what the DOT was smoking at that time, but she did a few of these. She got animals donated from the zoo. Really, really creative repurposing. Again, this stuff is not new. These are the 4 reasons I think that this movement is growing and growing so quickly. Great Recession, I don't have to say too much about that, but doing more with less became imperative for everybody in 2008. Shifting demographics, cities are becoming very, very vibrant places again. People are moving back into cities, reinvesting. It's this trend called the Great Inversion, where people are just really gravitating back towards inner cities. And it's playing out differently in every community, but it's definitely underway. What we call radical connectivity is just the use of the internet to share everything all at once, for better or for worse. We just have access to information like we've never had. And then there's this systemic frustration. This frustration with the processes that we have, particularly tied to the fact that we have a different way of thinking about change now, creating that change, whether we go online and donate to IOBI, or we see a project that we want to go mimic in our neighborhood, and our processes with cities are not really well set up for this kind of way of manufacturing change. People get very frustrated with the civic process. Getting permission, rules, ordinances, regulations, zoning codes from decades ago just don't make as much sense as they used to. Here's a great example from Dallas. They are the originators of the project called Build a Better Block, which is essentially what inspired the Broad Avenue project in 2010. What those guys did is they looked at all the rules they thought were prohibiting progress in their neighborhood, preventing businesses from starting. Things like abstract formulas and large fees to put awnings and put flowers on the sidewalk. I mean, things are just really silly when you think about the value that activating a space and getting a street to be vibrant again has when you're charging people $1,000 just to put flowers out there. It's silly. So when they had their project, they transformed this entire block for one weekend. They didn't tell the city they were doing that exactly. They got a street event permit, but they thought they were doing an art fair, and they put all the art into the buildings to activate it, put a bike lane on the ground with paint, called that art, and so to speak. But they circled all these ordinances, and they said, these are the rules that we're breaking very intentionally. These are the rules that have to change. And lo and behold, city council and the political leaders started to get it. They understood that their zoning code, for example, is from 1943. Why do we have a zoning code from 1943 that has these really old laws that don't make a lot of sense when we start updating those? Same thing with bike lanes in Cleveland. This example from outside Sacramento, California, a suburban neighborhood, some guy just went out and painted his own crosswalk. We call them guerrilla crosswalks, and there's dozens and dozens of people doing these projects these days. What I find really interesting about this is that it created this tension, this real moment of, yes, it's illegal, yes, there's a really big need for it. Neighbors love it, city dislikes it. It's this opportunity for a city to embrace the need to create change, to go in behind the civic activity of this, what I call a neighborhood leader, and saying, as a city, what can we do with our resources to address that issue? Maybe not with crooked lines, but in a way that this could become more permanent, that brings that benefit that's needed in that community. Orlando does this with, I just learned, with a rollout crosswalk. This is a carpet that they fashion, they tape it down, and put it across their arterial streets. That's going to make any DOT, any engineer in the room kind of scared. But neighbors love this. People love this civic action. Again, taking the leadership. Thank you for painting that crosswalk. Final example here. This guy, not that guy actually, but a guy in New Haven went out and did his own crosswalk as well. After a couple of years of the neighborhood supporting it and kind of winding it through the political process, this is the plan to upgrade that intersection based on the original guerrilla crosswalk. So the temporary becomes the permanent in a matter of a couple of years. And the guy who also did this project in the middle of the night illegally is now a city councilor. So it shows you the leadership role. When you take it, you get rewarded. So back to this conventional planning process. I love plans. I love making plans. It's what I do professionally. But there's some real flaws in how they're done, insofar that so many of them go on the shelf and sit there. Great ideas. You get the public to participate for months on end. You get their involvement. You build their trust, and you take those ideas and do nothing with them, or you do very little with them. And that's how you lose trust. That's how you have struggles in the public process. It's why people don't trust City Hall, they don't trust government in a lot of ways, because a lot of the things that are promised never come to fruition. This is back in my city in New York. This is Broadway again, and it was planned to be pedestrianized in 1969. A very popular idea at that time as well. But nothing ever happened with this. You can imagine getting political buy-in on Broadway for dozens of blocks to close the street with permanent infrastructure all at once? Hell no. Of course that project didn't go forward. It'd be almost impossible, until they did it this way. 40 years later, just lawn chairs, just traffic cones, let's just test it. Let's try it out. Maybe we can change people's opinions by showing them that all hell is not going to break loose. We close down Times Square and actually make it a square, make it a public space. That's exactly what they did. And when Carmageddon didn't break out and traffic kept moving and stores kept selling whatever they sell in Times Square, they took it to the next level. But they didn't go immediately and jump to the $10 million project, right? They said, there's still a lot of information we need to glean, we need to do more testing, we need to figure this out. And so they used just paint, which could always be removed fairly easily, tables and chairs. And again, what started to happen was a real cultural transformation, not only in Times Square, but across New York City. People from all over the world come and visit this space, and they start thinking differently about, well, this is really strange. I'm sitting in the lawn chair, I'm sitting in the movable chair, I'm on this paint, and it still looks like a street, but it's not really being used by cars. And lo and behold, the city found that the retail sales went through the roof, there was even more pedestrian traffic, it was safer for everybody, injuries went down by a third, and it became one of about 60 plazas that have been done or underway in this fashion across the city, in every neighborhood. It's amazing the amount of public space they've been able to carve out of asphalt on our streets. You'd think New York is so dense, how could you find room for more public space? Well, it's in the streets. Here's the rendering for what the permanent project will look like, and this is the ribbon cutting on the first phase of it. So the 5-year timeline, 2009, lawn chairs, 2014 in construction. Again, 5 years. You can do another update to your plan every 5 years and not get this kind of progress moving forward. So I find this to be really, really inspiring. And we look at this process as an inspiration for tactical urbanism. It's what we call build, measure, and learn. You test it first in a prototype kind of fashion, measure the results, learn from that, both good and bad, failures and successes, feed that back into the process, and do it again. So again, the Times Square is that sort of penultimate example. It also has something to do with design thinking. Who's heard the phrase design thinking as a way to solve problems? If not, it's something to look into. It's developed by lots of people. There's actually a long history to it. But the most recent and most popular version of this way of doing problem solving comes out of what they call the Stanford D School. It's not the B School, which is only associated with the business school, but D School for design school. And a lot of the thinking is you start with the idea of empathy, understanding what the problem is from the perspective of all the people who are dealing with the problem, asking questions, looking at context, understanding really on-the-ground conditions for those challenges. Then you can have a much better chance of defining what the actual problem is, understanding it more deeply, and then you can start to create some ideas about what should happen next. How do we respond to this issue? How do we respond to this challenge? And then you create a physical project, a prototype to deal with it. How do you do build to learn, as this person says, not build to last? The learning part of it is absolutely key. And then you physically test it, you learn, you move on to the next level. So it's very much like build, measure, learn. Design thinking is now being embedded in everything. Every industry is starting to look at this as a way to deal with their issues. And I think it is relevant to planning. So how are cities taking this up? Outside of New York, outside of certain other places? Well, LA, the Department of Transportation, has recently adopted this program called People Streets. And it's using the tactical urbanism tools of parklets and bicycle corrals and temporary plazas as a toolkit with pre-approved parts, pre-approved designs, kind of off-the-shelf solutions that might be able to work for neighborhood advocates, business owners, and residents. And anyone can come and apply with some consensus in a group that says we want to maintain this space. If the DOT will come and build it and put it in the ground, we will test, we'll help you measure it, and if it's successful, then we'll put it in the pipeline for permanence. They start with things like open streets. Open streets in Los Angeles gets about 100 to 150,000 people coming out on 7 to 10 miles of streets 3 or 4 times a year. They also do pop-up events, either as part of that or independently for a weekend or for a week long. The People Street program is more about kind of the annual process of how you test over the course of a year. And then finally, they move that into the permanent streetscape plan. So you see how this turns everything on its head? You don't start with the streetscape plan up front. You start with the smaller increments of investment, the smaller increments of change, testing things out, getting people involved, changing the culture around how we do planning and development in our cities. So concluding these examples, I'd say we need, yes, strategy, we need longer term vision. We need to think about how all this interplays with not just planning, but every other field that impacts the city, departments, etc. But we also need the tactics. We need the tactics for testing, for trying things out, for learning successes and failures moving forward. So I'm going to leave you with just 3 projects that we've worked on, 3 common applications of tactical urbanism. And when we started the manuals and the research and the writing, we weren't doing any of this work within our practice. I've been so inspired by how other people do it, that we've learned how to integrate it within our own. So the first example is more citizen-led, unsanctioned. How do you instigate change as an advocate? How do you instigate change and culture change in your city when very few people are listening or very few leaders are taking action? Second step, municipality organization, doing public involvement projects with tactical demonstrations. So when I go to planning meetings and we're not doing tactical urbanism as part of it, you get the same kind of people showing up time and time again. They have excess time on their hands. They're very civically involved. This is all good things, but they purport to represent neighborhoods they oftentimes don't. They don't necessarily represent the majority. How do we reach many more people? Many more people will then come out to a city hall, public meeting. We've got to have more tools for that. And finally, a municipality or developer implements what we call phase 0. That very early stage project that, yes, tests things out, but ideally also brings benefit in the short term rather than waiting years and years. So I'm going to transport you now to Hamilton, Ontario, which I'm sure I know Grayson knows Hamilton. Does anyone else know Hamilton? A couple hands? Yeah, it's an old steel town. It's one of Canada's poorest cities. It's been struggling for many, many years economically, but it's got a lot of impassioned people. It's got a lot of people driving change from the bottom up. And a group of them got together and asked me to come do a workshop alongside them last spring, which is a great opportunity. So we picked 5 sites, 5 challenging prototypical sites of various conditions around the city, from suburban locations to downtown to inner neighborhood. And we were looking specifically at intersections. How do we create change in these intersections very inexpensively? The group that brought me there was able to raise $4,000 to pay for interventions and projects at all 5 of these locations. With some hope that the powers that be will pay attention and help them create that change. So the overall mantra for the project became calm, reclaim, and recreate. Again, they want safer streets, they want complete streets, not just a policy, but action and implementation of the policy. So I'm just going to talk about one of these projects, as fun as the other 4 were. Here's an elementary school. This is a little commercial neighborhood street. And then here is Herkimer Street. Herkimer Street is 2 lanes, 1 direction. Used to be 2 directions where traffic would go quite slowly. Over time, they transferred that over to a 1-way street. And when that happened, cars started to speed through the neighborhood. They started to take these corners a lot faster, and it became dangerous to walk. They also had these low visibility crosswalks, and at higher speeds, harder to see as a driver. On the ground, this is what the neighborhood fabric looks like. Otherwise, a very, very nice neighborhood, but you can kind of see the racetrack set up there, ready to go. So this is the person who called me and I was working with, Graham. Graham's an architect, and the intervention for this project was to do curb extensions. How do we pilot test curb extensions to shorten the crossing distance, make pedestrians more visible at the intersection, and slow down cars? Graham is right here drilling, screwing in cones to the asphalt. Not recommended. You know, you learn that lesson pretty quickly. Build, measure, learn, right? But in the morning, it looked like this. You know, again, not high urban design, but it got the job done. So much so that when I interviewed the crossing guard the next morning, she said, I support it, I get it. This is slowing people down, it's making it safer for the kids. This is a wonderful change. So it's, again, just these 2 corners, and that's the elementary school. So the organization, the group that brought me there, also had me on the hook to come back 2 weeks later. So this was fun. The whole charge was, we're going to design out these interventions, you guys go do it, I'll come back in 2 weeks, and we'll tell a much bigger audience at this larger event about all the projects that you guys did and the hopeful successes. Well, the local newspaper picked up on that, and they're looking at all these active imaginations, really starting to impact Hamilton's neighborhoods. And then the city got a hold of this. And the city understood that what we were doing was actually illegal and, yes, potentially unsafe. Even though we know all the projects were using proven urban design and planning techniques to make it safer. But because we were not experts, or they were not experts, what they were doing was not supported. This is an internal memo from the city manager to city council saying, I think we're experiencing this tactical urbanism. Gotta crack down. You know, and as I've been saying this week, this was kind of my, oh no, this is where the whole thing ends. I will no longer be invited anywhere. I'm going to get sued. Call my business partner. Like, what kind of insurance coverage do we have? Like, what are we dealing with here? And you know, the advocates picked right up on this. My favorite line is, do not approach them directly. Yeah, tongue really cheeky. They did another one of them as well. You know, only you can stop urbanism. No safe streets, please. You know, brought to you by the City of Hamilton Department of Roadway Security and Asphalt Relocation. So no one really stood up and took claim of these posters that started to circulate around town and on social media, but it got a lot of attention. So much so that the city started to look really foolish. And the group that brought me up there stepped forward and they said, all right, it was us, our fault. Look, we have a conversation about why we did this. Actually, turns out they were all professionals, and yeah, they had to be neighborhood advocates, but they had a real purpose and real intent for doing this. And even if it just got into the conversation at the table to talk to the city about it, it probably would have been a success. But what happened moving forward surprised us all. 4 days later, here's the production of the master plan for the neighborhood intersection, the upgrade. High visibility crosswalks and curb extensions to be implemented on a temporary pilot basis. This is less than a month after we had the workshop. That's May 28th, 5 days later, it's in the ground. It really created that change that quickly. The city started to become very proud of their intersection upgrade, their intersection repair. They got very, very excited by the positive attention they were getting, and they said, you know what, that was actually quite cheap. You know what, that's actually quite easy. We should do more of those. And that's exactly what they did. In fact, they made this one more permanent. It's hard to see in this image, but this is taken over the winter. The curb and concrete came in after the pilot project, and the city started moving around to many other locations and lots of neighborhoods and spreading out the benefit to everybody. And so this article came out in that same blog, September 24th. The city embraces tactical urbanism. 67 complete or underway. Right? This all started with $4,000 of funding, about $750 about spent on cones and paint to paint the cones, and probably a lot of drill bits. And it created this huge impact. Again, this is not something that's going to build us light rail systems. It's not going to give us the affordable housing that we need so desperately in our cities, but it's going to get some things done. It can be a tool for that from the citizen side. So the second example, how does a municipality or an organization use this to bring more people into the process? Who knows Somerville, Massachusetts? Yeah, next to Cambridge, very close to Boston. You've got hundreds of square miles in your city in Memphis, and a lot of cities do as you go south and west. Somerville is 3.7 square miles. It's tiny, but it's really dense. I think they have 75,000 people living in their city. It's more dense than the city of Boston, actually. 18,000 people per square mile or something ridiculous. So anyways, this is City Hall, and it's a very successful place. It used to be called Slummerville, but has really gentrified a lot in the last 20 or 30 years, largely based on the arrival of a Red Line subway stop here in Davis Square. Old neighborhood, really odd intersection, really hard to figure out, but a really dynamic place, except for the edges. The edges are full of these little parking lots, and because of the demand to be in the neighborhood, they have to transform these parking lots into a higher and better use, whether that's homes, or that's new office buildings, or it's public space. The city really wants to start developing these. So they started to see that process with the streetscape plan. Going right to the consultants and saying, how do we make this street more functional? How do we make it prettier, make it more livable? And so they came up with a bunch of different projects. All of them, in my opinion, were good recommendations, including this one, which was the addition of a new plaza in the neighborhood. I'll zoom in on this. See, there's a little triangle park here, and it's about 9 parking spaces in this triangle, and then this little slip street. Whenever you see grids come together at odd angles, you often get these little dog legs on the street. And so the idea is to close that, and then make this curb radius such that buses and cars could take that turn, and you get to reclaim all that space. Great idea, You'd think that people would be behind that. Yay, more public space, right? There's the master plan for what it would look like in schematics. And this was the result. And the city was like, wait, what? This is a really good project. We had the money for this kind of projects. This is the intent of the master plan, or the streetscape plan, and the public came out, swinging arrows. They were not supportive of this project. And why is that? Why does that happen so often when ideas come forward that are largely supported by many others in the neighborhood, but comes right down to the stakeholders around the project? They don't want change. Well, it's all about representation. Who's at those meetings? Who's being asked to consult it? Who's invited in? Are you asking people to come to you, or are you going to where they are and having those conversations? And so when we got hired along with several other firms to do a neighborhood plan, that built on this streetscape plan. We said, well, hold on a minute. Let's look at your streetscape plan, look more closely, look at those elements. What worked in that plan? And we saw, of course, that plaza. And we said, that's brilliant. You just executed it the wrong way. You were telling people you're going to do it in a permanent manner from the very beginning. People don't like change. They don't like change thrown at them. They don't like it to be so immediate and permanent. We need to ease them in. We need to change the culture around how we deliver the change. And so the idea became, let's just make it a pop-up plaza. Let's have the charrette, 3 days worth of design, planning meetings, etc., in an adjacent empty storefront, and then actually invite people to come and experience what a plaza would be like if it were to be built there. So this is the morning of normal whole parking lot. The cars get removed, Public Works starts to come in, do their thing, put out all it took was a few orange cones, very easy stuff. And then a couple of food trucks, a coffee cart started to show up. We put out tables and chairs with colorful tablecloths, things that were bought down at the corner store, 3 blocks away, and started to just tinker with the space. This guy got it immediately. As soon as we put the tables and chairs out there, he was, sitting down enjoying the space. That was encouraging, and then by lunchtime, it was a truly active public square. Obviously, the food helps, showing there's a real need for more vending, particularly around meal times in the neighborhood, and showing that people would come to this space, would activate it, would hang out. It's actually really interesting. That's Brad Rawson, who's one of our clients. Turns out, nobody knew this until we had this pop-up plaza. He's a heck of a musician. So he, the second day, brought his guitar, brought his bandmate, and they played for 2 hours out on this little pallet stage that we built them. On all these tables with all these people, we had comment cards. What do you think about this plaza? How does this make you feel? Would you want this in your neighborhood? Oh, by the way, would you want to come across the street and learn more about this process, learn more about how we can transform this into permanence? And what happened was the plaza became more and more active. More and more people started tweeting about this project. What we learned quickly on this project was, working with food trucks is phenomenal because they have a huge Twitter following. They say they're going to be someplace, people are going to come, and all of a sudden, this is, yes, a place to eat, but it's also a planning project. So then we had all sorts of new people come in to our meetings. That's the plaza. That's a coffee truck right there. That's Russ. I work a lot with him. That's me. And that's the lady who was at every single meeting for weeks on end. Everybody else was kind of new to the process and wanted to know more about the project. This was the recommendation. Overwhelmingly, the majority of the comment cards we got, which were a lot, was make this plaza permanent, which is great. So the city feels much more emboldened, to much wider support to say, all right, let's take the first stab at it. They're not going to do the permanent plaza immediately. They're going to do the next iteration, which is do a monthly kind of event there, transforming it into this plaza space. Okay, finally, phase 0 implementation. How do you get something done in the very short term, not to lose momentum in the plan? This project takes us all the way to a town called Penrith, Australia. I'm guessing nobody's heard of Penrith. Oh, one person. And why is that?
Because I grew up in Sydney.
Excellent. It's only an hour away. Cool. All right. Nice to have an Australian in the room. So this project was actually done by a colleague and collaborator of mine. She's based in Sydney. She did a master plan for the city's High Street, basically what we call Main Street. This is the regional shopping mall that basically killed High Street. Probably not a good strategy to put a massive mall next to your Main Street that close. But anyways, Place Partners is this firm we worked with. They identified this as an opportunity area. You see in the zoom in here, this wide swath of asphalt. They created a master plan around that to create a public space where that wide swath of asphalt was. And they knew that this was a very expensive, big project to do this in a permanent way. The city doesn't have a lot of money. It's a town of 20,000, 30,000 people, quite impoverished. And so her idea was, well, got this colleague in the States, and he talks about this tactical stuff. Maybe this is a good way to pilot test this idea. We had a great public process, a lot of involvement, but if we don't get something done quickly, we're going to lose that trust. So the idea became to activate all this space as well as that full half block. What you can see here is there's no place to sit. It's very, very hot in the summer. There's no tree cover. This wall here prevents you from crossing the street like you'd like to. And so I flew over there and we did this workshop. But this was a different kind of workshop. This wasn't let's just create good ideas and talk about making change and maybe doing some small-scale tests, which would have been all fine and good. This was the city council saying, oh yeah, we're really behind this idea. Oh yeah, we do want to continue building trust. They put down $40,000 to implement whatever it was we came up with in the workshop as a one-year pilot project. That changed the game entirely. Everyone who was at the table and talking about this project, they knew what was going to happen. What came out of that day was going to be built in one way or another. So the stakes are much higher. So we started mapping out and arguing over where should trees go, how big should they be, to scale. We had this really interesting kit of parts, right? So there's stumps and benches and picnic tables, all these little elements that are pretty inexpensive that we could work with in the short term that were permanent enough they could last for a year. And the Public Works Department pre-approved all this stuff. They said, yep, that's good, that's low maintenance, we're okay with that. Oh yeah, we can get that onto our trucks, all those sorts of things. They looked at that and they were in support of it. And so we gave all the attendees a budget, broken into 3 teams, said each team has $10,000. The last $10,000, in theory, is left over to sort of stitch all your plans together. So they all had to create budgets to make it really realistic. And this is the master plan. This is the result after one day. It might look like your granddaughter or your daughter or your cousin's 6th grade art project, but it actually has some really phenomenal ideas in here. So this is team 1, this is team 2, this is team 3, and that's that wide swath of asphalt. Place partners translated this vision into a real sketch here, showing where things would go. This was the site, the main part of the project site, one day, and this is the next. Right? And what I love saying about this is the rendering in real time. You can spend, I've been on projects before, you spend $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 on the actual graphics, on the renderings and the professional photo simulations, and that still remains in theory and in concept, and people have a hard time understanding that. This is just real. People can go and say, I like this or I hate this, or I'm ambivalent. And that was the whole point. And so the community started to take ownership over this. They had their tree lighting ceremony. This is them setting it up. Some of the business owners started to reclaim the sidewalk space, put out flowers and plants and things, had a community message board, music started to be programmed. The city learned something very quickly in this process too. It was built a month later. The city realized, the city councilors, et cetera, they don't really have the day-to-day management skills or staff to water the grass, make sure the park is cleaned up, et cetera. So eventually they handed it over to the local business merchants association. As soon as that transformation happened, and there was day-to-day stewardship of the site, the grass became greener, there was more programming all of a sudden, and some of the businesses started taking even more ownership of the park. So their trial project it's only been about 6 months. So we don't know what the results are going to be. There's been pros, there's been some cons. They've learned through this process. The point is they're trying. They're trying for 40 grand, not $1 million, which is going to be the project price tag. If that had been built in a permanent way from the beginning and failed, man, that's a big mistake. That's a lot of money down the drain. We might as well try it for a year, for 6 months, for 3 months, for a weekend, see if we can get something going. And so all this is about changing what we call the project delivery process. Chuck has been talking about it all week. It's something that I hammer on a lot. How we do things can change. We can get different and better results. We can be more inclusive from the beginning. And so this leads us to Memphis. And I'll just share a few thoughts on this city. There's a lot of really creative things happening here. I love visiting Memphis because of the things that you see on what seems to be possible, that people are really action-oriented. Parking day is one of the most simple day-long interventions that happens, but we've seen it lead to longer-term change. You guys have definitely taken that upon yourselves each year, which is interesting. That then has come to the next level. This is the new face for an old broad. Everyone knows this project, right? Can I explain this one? Everyone's nodding their head. Obviously a huge success. Very small seed of investment up front. Has transformed this block, transformed the street, shown that there was an appetite for this kind of environment to come back online in Memphis. This is a national case study of national prominence. The men's shop program that's been developed. How do we activate these spaces that are vacant but have great potential? Oftentimes, as Tommy has said a lot and others have said in Memphis, the difference between opening up a shop and not is usually just a few $1,000s. and getting access to that. It's very difficult to access that kind of capital, even though it's a small amount. You can close that gap and bring people in slowly, give them some rent breaks. You get this kind of environment. People really start to make the change. MemShop in Overton Square, very successful program. Memphis is kind of the, not the inside of buildings, but between the buildings kind of approach, which has been happening in several different neighborhoods. And I just haven't seen a lot of cities advancing tactical urbanism in this way. The brewery, who's going to go and have a beer tomorrow? I sure am. It's been a long week. This is a really exciting project. To take a historic building and amenity like this and just forget about the upper floors, forget about the pro forma. Can we just get something going now on the ground floor and see if we can entice people to invest in this building in a larger way, see if we can't get revenue going in the short term, prove out a different model. Let's think differently about how we activate and reactivate our buildings. This space is so cool. One of the coolest buildings I've seen in a while. And look, this is the project by Memphians. This is creative, it's getting people together, it's building social capital, building those relationships. Really, really impactful already, in my opinion. Everyone seems to be talking about it around town, right? So this mantra, let's test it and then invest, is a good one. Here's your famous street art. And your mayor seems to be behind this idea. At least we've got him on record saying so. I forget the article this was from. It was from a couple of years ago. But he's spot on when he says, let's encourage these small, low-risk, community-driven improvements everywhere, right? Everywhere. There are opportunities to do things like this, right? But it's not happening everywhere necessarily. This is one of the challenges that you all have moving forward. How do you take ideas like this that have taken root in a select handful of neighborhoods and those tools and those processes and those investments, how do we get those outside of just the sort of downtown and midtown corridors? This is a fundamental challenge. I don't have an answer for you tonight. I really don't. But I think there's insight and there's tools that can be used in all sorts of great ways. And how to design this system, a different kind of system, to enable that agility, to enable those small risks, those small projects. Right now, government, not just in Memphis, but everywhere, is not oriented to do this, or do this very well. This question came up when I was here about a month ago. I talked to a lot of people in Memphis from all different sectors, and some of you are in the room, and we had lots of great productive conversations, and one of them was, why is it easier, or just as easy in a lot of ways, to get $2 million versus $20,000, or even $2,000? Why is that such a challenge? Well, as we discussed, it's this transaction cost. It takes a lot of effort to get a grant, to apply for money, to make that ask, to bring those resources together. So by the time you've gone through all these processes, big foundations and big players just assume give you $2 million and not $20,000. But oftentimes, sure, we'd all love to have $2 million, but $20,000 would do just fine, for the next year. You can do a lot with that in neighborhoods, working tactically. So this is the role. This is the power of IOB. So I'm going to sell it to you as well. This is a tool we've seen work in neighborhoods all across the country as an online tool to bring resources and people together to put small amounts of capital towards projects that benefit everybody. I think this might be a way to start working in neighborhoods outside of just those typical downtown, midtown areas. Another insight that I got from talking to a lot of people, you guys are all hacking the system. Everybody is figuring out a way to get something done because the current system is very restricted. It's very difficult. Whether you're at City Hall or you're working as a developer, whether you're a small or large developer, we're finding ways to get things done somehow, somewhere. In the spirit of the law, perhaps sometimes, but getting it done. But not everybody has that information. That takes experience. It takes knowing the right people, who to call on the phone, how do we get around this. So daylighting that information is a very important step. It's a very important thing to be done in terms of making the public process, making change, making visible, available to people to understand in a more visual, intuitive way. I tried to find lots of these kinds of processes online through your city website. Maybe they're there somewhere, but I couldn't access them. So that could be a challenge, particularly with new kinds of projects. The Memphixes of the world, there's no real precedent for that. Well, there's a lot of interest and there's a lot of power in that. So we have to figure this out. Final slide, I think. Just a couple of ideas. Embed this process, figure this out, even in just a pilot area, a pilot neighborhood to start. How do we change the rules so that the project delivery process includes the build, measure, learn ideas? Take projects that have been done from the plans from years ago, or even last year or last week. Take them off the shelf, see what aspects can be tested in the short term. This interface between all the sectors, keep improving upon that. That's always critical to keep that communication moving forward, keep those processes flowing. Existing initiatives. Opening the brewery during Memphis in May is very, very smart because you're going to have this big captive audience. A lot of people visiting. There's going to be a lot of media written about Memphis in May in general, and so this is a really well time. Think about how you can do that in your own neighborhood. That can be as simple as doing a project on Sunday morning next to the church, and everyone's in the neighborhood for church. You've got this captive group to see something, start talking about it. The littlest thing can become a much bigger thing if it needs to be. And finally, the lesson we always talk about from Hamilton is scaling down to scale up. You might have really grand ideas, and I think we all do, and that's great. You've got to find that starting point, that foothold that can create that change. And that change is hard. Back to Dallas, the city that pioneered Build a Better Block, when all the city councilors came in behind and said, yes, we're going to change these ordinances. This article came out yesterday. They're still struggling with getting that done 4 years later. Simple ordinances change is very, very difficult. But with that, say you guys make a difference. Everybody can. Thank you very much.